One day, I realized that the person I had trusted most for more than 30 years had kept from me a secret I was never once asked about. Some pain does not come from strangers. It comes from the very person you believe you never need to doubt. If it were you, when that truth surfaced, would you choose to lay everything bare? Or continue to remain silent to keep the family at peace? I did not react in the way many people would consider right. And what happened afterwards led me to understand something very different about love and kindness. If you have ever had the feeling that something was not quite right, but did not dare to look it straight in the face, then perhaps this story is for you. My name is Helen Morris. I am now in my early 60s. When I look back on my life, the first thing that comes to mind is not major upheavals, but regularity. For more than 35 years of marriage, my life was built on repeated routines, so stable that one could believe nothing could possibly be wrong. My husband, Richard Morris, worked in the finance industry. He was careful, reserved, and principled. Every week on a fixed day, he left the house at the same hour to go to the bank. That habit lasted so many years that I stopped paying attention to it. It was like the sun rising each morning, always there, with no need to ask why. Richard and I divided our lives very clearly. He handled money, paperwork, and decisions involving numbers. I took care of the house, the meals, the children, things that cannot be measured on a spreadsheet. I used to think that was a natural kind of fairness. Each person did their part well, and the family would remain at peace. Richard never appeared rushed or anxious when talking about money. He often told me that everything was fine. I believed him, not because I was careless, but because I thought trust was also a form of love. At the time, I thought that doubting the person you had shared your life with for decades was not something one should do. I grew up in a family that taught me that if you live kindly, life will not betray you. Things may not always go your way, but at least you will not lose everything. I believe that in a simple way, not blindly, but as a choice to live more lightly. Maintaining household calm and harmony was deeply important to me. Occasionally, very rarely, I had the sense that I did not fully understand what Richard was doing. Numbers, accounts, and documents were always beyond my reach. At times, I wondered if one day I had to manage on my own. Would I even know where to begin? But those thoughts came quickly and faded just as fast. I reassured myself that I should not overthink things, that everyone has strengths and weaknesses, and Richard was good at what I was not. I did not blame myself for not asking more questions. At the time, I saw no reason to be suspicious. Our life went on as usual. The children grew up and moved out. Dinners became quieter. Mornings became slower. I thought that was the reward for a life lived without wrongdoing. If someone had told me then that this calm was only a surface, I would probably have smiled and shaken my head. Not because I knew the truth, but because I believe that when you live honestly, the world around you will eventually be honest as well. Richard died on an ordinary morning, in a way the doctors later described as quick and clean. A heart attack, no warning, no time for last words. When I received the call, I was standing in the kitchen, my hands still wet from washing cups and glasses. I heard the voice on the other end, precise, careful, and I understood what had happened before they finished the sentence. I went to the hospital alone. Richard was already gone. His face was calm, as if asleep. I stood there for quite a while without crying. I don't think I have felt anything at all yet. Some news is so overwhelming that the body does not respond right away. The funeral took place a few days later, quiet and straightforward. Friends, neighbors, and Richard's former colleagues came to offer condolences. Everyone said he was a good man, hard-working, reliable. I nodded, thanked them, listened. I still did not cry much. Some people looked at me with concern, as if waiting for a delayed breakdown to occur, but that breakdown never came. Instead, there was a feeling that was very hard to put into words. It was not happiness, nor was it relief in the usual sense. It was like setting down a heavy bag you had carried for so long that you forgot it was heavy. When you let go, you do not cheer. You simply exhale a little longer than usual. I felt guilty for realizing that. The man I had lived with for more than 35 years had just died. I should have been more devastated. In the days that followed, I asked myself repeatedly whether I was heartless. However, I then realized that emotions are not something you can force. They arrive in their own way, at their own time. I did not take Richard's death lightly. I loved him in the way one loves someone with whom they have walked through most of their life. Yet at the same time, deep inside, a part of me had loosened, as if a quiet tension, one that had existed for a very long time without my ever naming it, had just left my body. At that point, I did not understand why. I only knew that my body reacted before my mind could make sense of it. Perhaps there are things the mind has sensed for a long time, but only when everything stops does it finally allow them to speak. 3 days after the funeral, as the house began to settle back into its familiar, quiet rhythm, I received a letter. A white envelope, nothing unusual, my name printed clearly in the center. The sender was the bank. I opened it in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, as I always did when reading official correspondence. The contents were brief and courteous. The bank expressed its condolences and informed me that I was a joint holder of a safe deposit box my husband had opened many years earlier. They asked that I contact them to arrange a time to come in and complete the procedure to open the box. I read the letter twice, then a third time. Richard had never mentioned any safe deposit box, not once. In more than 35 years of living together, I thought I knew everything about our shared life. The letter did not make me panic, but my heart sank, the way it does when you miss a step on the stairs without falling, just managing to catch yourself. I called the bank that same afternoon. The woman on the other end of the line spoke in a gentle and professional tone. She confirmed that the box was registered in both Richard's name and mine, and that I had full access to it. We scheduled an appointment for one morning during the week. I decided to go alone, not because I wanted to hide anything, but because I needed to face this quietly first. In the days leading up to the appointment, I walked around the house more than usual. I opened drawers Richard had always kept meticulously organized. I looked at neatly labeled folders. Everything still looked the same, almost too normal. That morning, I dressed neatly, not because I thought I needed to impress anyone, but because I wanted to remind myself to stay steady. On the drive to the bank, I drove more slowly than usual. The sky was lightly overcast, no rain. I remember whispering to myself very softly that whatever awaited me, I needed to look at it directly. It was not great courage, just a choice. I believe that living in uncertainty is what truly wears a person down. The truth, no matter how difficult, at least has a precise shape. It may hurt, but it does not lurk in the shadows. When I stepped into the bank, the cool air and the soft echo of footsteps on the stone floor made me feel as though I was crossing some kind of threshold. I did not yet know what lay inside that metal box. I only knew that once I was here, turning my back would not make anything disappear, and if this was the door to the truth, I would rather open it than stand before it pretending not to see it. The bank manager led me into a small, quiet room. On the table sat a gray metal box, unremarkable in every way. She told me I could have the room to myself, then closed the door behind her. I sat down, placed both hands on the box, and took a slow breath. In that moment, I realized I was trembling slightly. When the lid opened, inside were neatly stacked folders. Richard had always been organized like that. I picked up the first folder and turned the pages one by one. They were investment reports. Negative numbers appeared more often than I had expected. There were significant losses that spanned many years. I did not understand every detail, but I understood enough to know these were not minor risks that could be brushed aside. I set that folder down and picked up the next one. This time, it contained mortgage loans. Our house appeared in the documents, alongside figures I had never seen before. There were multiple loans taken out at different times. I read slowly, line by line. The air in the room seemed to thicken. I had to stop several times just to catch my breath. The third folder made my hands go cold. It contained credit cards. My name was printed clearly at the top of each copy, my address, my social security number. I looked at the signature line. The handwriting was not mine. I had signed my name enough times in my life to know that with certainty. I sat there for a long time. There was no crying, no violent panic, just a sense of dizziness, like standing up too quickly. I placed a hand on my chest to remind myself to breathe evenly. In my mind, everything became very clear in a cold and stark way. Richard had used my name. He had opened credit cards without my knowledge. He had placed my financial future into decisions I had never been asked about. The truth did not arrive like a heavy blow, but like a light switching on in a dark room. Harsh, but not surprising. What surprised me most was that my first thought was not anger. I did not think of him as a bad person. I did not feel betrayed in the loud, dramatic way people often describe. Instead, I felt a very familiar fear, as though I had sensed it somewhere for years without ever naming it. I recalled the times Richard avoided my gaze when I asked straightforward questions about money. The times he said everything was fine, his voice just a little more rushed than usual. I suddenly understood that he had not done all of this out of malice. He had done it out of fear of failure, fear of admitting mistakes, fear of shattering the image of a reliable husband he had tried to maintain his entire life. He had not dared to face it, and when someone cannot look directly at their own mistakes, they will find ways to hide them again and again, until everything slips beyond their control. I placed the folders back into the box, aligning them carefully. When I stood up, my legs felt weak, but my mind was clear. I knew that from this moment on, I was no longer living in uncertainty. This was not a collapse. This was the moment I saw things exactly as they were. And although this truth was heavy, I understood that only by facing it could I move forward, without being pulled backwards by things that had never been spoken aloud. At the bottom of the box, beneath the thick, heavy stacks of documents, was a cream-colored envelope. My name was written on it in Richard's familiar handwriting, not shaky, not hurried. His writing was always like that, even in matters that would unsettle others. I picked up the envelope and sat down. I did not open it right away. For a very brief moment, I thought that if I did not read it, everything might stop here. But I knew that was only a passing thought. I had opened the box. I had seen the truth. There was no reason to turn back. The letter was not long. Richard wrote that he was sorry, not in a way that begged for forgiveness, but like someone exhausted from trying to hold together something that could no longer stand. He wrote about an investment decision made many years earlier when he believed he could turn things around if he pushed just a little harder. When things did not go as he expected, he did not stop. He kept going, hoping he could fix the mistake before I ever found out. He wrote that he was afraid of worrying me, afraid of breaking the sense of calm that I had always cherished. He believed that if he carried it all himself and endured long enough, everything would eventually return to normal. He did not dwell on the consequences. He only said that at some point he realized he had gone too far, but no longer knew how to turn back. I read the letter in silence. There was no emotional outburst, only a deep, steady sadness like a slow-moving current. I could clearly see that Richard had loved me in the way he understood love. However, I could also clearly see that this love was not enough to compensate for the choices he had made. I did not use the letter to excuse him. His fear did not justify what he had done. The damage was still there. The consequences remained unchanged. Nor did I rush to offer forgiveness. Some things need time to be put back in their proper place. But when I finished reading, I did not carry hatred with me. Understanding does not mean acceptance. It simply helped me avoid turning this pain into a hard knot inside my heart. Richard had chosen to avoid the truth. I did not want to make that choice again. I folded the letter, placed it back into the envelope, and returned it to the box. What I needed to know, I now knew. And from here on, I understood that the rest of the story did not lie in his past, but in how I would move forward from this truth. I spoke with my children the evening I returned from the bank. I did not intend to tell them everything at once, but I also did not want to keep things hidden any longer. Silence had already done enough. I did not want it to continue making decisions on my behalf. My son Daniel came over first. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, listening for a long time without interrupting. I showed him some of the documents, not to persuade him, but to help him understand why I could not pretend that nothing had happened. Daniel read slowly, asked a few brief questions, then looked at me. "What are you going to do next?" he asked. That question made me feel lighter. He did not ask if I was sure. He did not doubt my memory or my feelings. He simply wanted to know what I needed. I told him that I did not yet have all the answers, but I knew I could not go back to the way things were. Daniel nodded. He said he would stand by me, whatever I chose. My daughter, Laura, called later. Her voice was tense from the very beginning. When I told her, Laura was silent for a long time. Then she said that perhaps I had misunderstood, that her father was not that kind of person, that he loved the family and would never do anything to harm us. I did not argue. I did not present more evidence. I knew that Laura was not defending the truth, but the image of her father she had believed in all her life. I told her that I understood, that I too had believed in that image for a very long time. I did not ask her to believe me right away. I only said that when she was ready, I would show her everything. The call ended in a heavy silence. I knew I had just lost a familiar closeness with my daughter, at least for a while. That hurt, but it did not make me regret my choice. Some truths cannot be softened to make them easier to hear. In the days that followed, Daniel helped me organize the paperwork. He worked carefully, without rushing. Laura kept her distance. She texted less often, and when she did, her messages were brief. I did not push her. I did not offer further explanations. I gave her the space she needed to face something she was not yet ready to see. I understood that each person awakens at a different pace. The truth does not always arrive at the same time for everyone. It does not need to be believed immediately to exist. I had learned that forcing others to see what they cannot yet bear only pushes them further away. I am still their mother. I did not choose the truth to stand against anyone. I chose it so that I would not continue living in uncertainty. If my children need time, I can wait. The truth does not disappear just because it has not yet been accepted. And when the time comes, it will find its own way to be seen in the gentlest way possible. After several days of deliberation, I consulted a lawyer at the bank manager's recommendation. The appointment took place on a quiet morning. The office was small and bright, lacking the cold, intimidating atmosphere I had always imagined in places associated with litigation. I carried a briefcase filled with neatly organized documents, as if external order might help me maintain order within. The lawyer listened as I told my story from beginning to end. I did not add or omit anything, nor did I try to soften it. When I placed the final folder on the table, she looked up and spoke in a tone that was very plain. What I was facing was not merely poor financial management, it was financial abuse within a marriage, the use of control to conceal, to manipulate, and to place the other person at risk without their knowledge. Hearing those words did not shock me. It simply brought clarity. It felt like someone was finally naming a pain that had been aching quietly for a very long time. It did not make the pain disappear, but at least I knew I had not imagined it. The legal process began with tasks that were very small and very draining: filing forms, making phone calls, waiting for responses, explaining the same story again and again to different people. There were days when I felt exhausted simply from having to recall every detail. I was not accustomed to having my private life put on trial by the law. At times, I wondered whether I should stop, whether I was making things more complicated than they needed to be. Richard was gone. No one would be punished in the usual sense. But whenever that thought surfaced, I remembered one thing with absolute clarity. If I stayed silent, if I let it go, then on paper, what was wrong would remain as if it were right, and I would have to live with the consequences for the rest of my life. I did not continue out of anger. I was not trying to defeat anyone. I simply wanted the truth to be put in its proper place. I wanted the documents bearing my name to reflect accurately what I had done and what I had never done. I wanted the law to recognize that trust does not mean complicity. There were meetings so long that I left with my head heavy. I learned to pause before reacting, not to reply to emails when I was too tired, not to make calls when my thoughts were still tangled. I understood that if I let anger lead the way, I would lose the most important thing I was trying to protect, my clarity of mind. The lawyer told me that this path could take many months. There might be times when I feel entirely alone. I nodded. I was ready for that. Not because I had become stronger than before, but because I no longer wanted to avoid the truth. Throughout the process, I kept reminding myself of one thing. Justice is not allowed victory. It is allowing the truth to exist without distortion. It is not letting what is wrong remain undisturbed simply because it has existed for a long time. I do not know how this will end, but I do know that by walking this path, I have chosen not to betray myself again. As my meetings with the lawyer began to space out, as the paperwork no longer came in relentless waves as it had in the first weeks, I realized I needed a different rhythm to my life, not to forget what was happening, but to keep my entire existence from revolving around it. I began to think about returning to work. The idea came slowly with a hint of awkwardness. I was in my early 60s. I had spent most of my life at home, caring for my family. I had worked part-time many years ago, but had long since stopped. I was no longer young, nor did I have many new skills, but I needed something that would allow me to stand on my own, even if only in a small way. I submitted applications to a few places near my home, including the library, a bookstore, and a small shop that sells office supplies and stationery. I did not share my story in my applications. I simply said that I wanted to return to work. When I was hired by an independent bookstore 3 days a week, I felt both relieved and uncertain. The work was simple: shelving books, handling payments, answering familiar questions. No one knew who I was beyond the name on the small badge. Going to work in the mornings gave me a reason to leave the house. I learned to manage every small expense, to write everything down, to look directly at numbers instead of avoiding them as I had before. For the first time in my married life, I knew exactly how much I had, how much I needed, and how I could manage. At times, I found it almost amusing that I was learning these things at an age when many people had become familiar with them much earlier. But I did not feel ashamed. Starting late does not mean starting wrong. I had spent many years trusting someone else to handle this part of life. Now I was learning to do it myself gradually. The job did not make me wealthy, but it gave me a sense of usefulness, that I could take care of myself, even if slowly, even if clumsily. Each day was no longer just a matter of waiting for outcomes from legal exchanges. I was rebuilding a rhythm of life from the most minor, most ordinary things. And it was precisely that ordinariness that gradually made me feel less swept along and more firmly standing on my own 2 feet. Laura called me one late afternoon just as I had finished my shift at the bookstore. Her voice was completely different from before. No tension, no defensiveness. just exhaustion and trembling, like someone who has walked for a very long time and has finally been forced to stop. She said she had gone to the bank. At first, it was only to prove that I had misunderstood. She wanted to see the documents herself, the ones I had mentioned. But when the staff brought out the files, when she saw her own name on a credit card she had never opened, everything collapsed in a tranquil way. Laura spoke slowly, as if each sentence had to be carefully weighed. She had never used that card. She had never been aware of that debt. But the signature was there, not hers. I listened, my chest tightening, not from surprise, but because I knew that feeling, that moment of realizing that part of your life has been decided for you without your knowing. She cried, not loudly, but with a sound caught in her throat. She apologized to me. Apologized for not believing you. Apologized for thinking that I was damaging her father's image. I did not blame her. I told her that not believing me at first was a very human thing to do. Everyone needs time to let go of a belief they have held for too long. We sat together that evening. There was no arguing. No one blamed anyone. Just a mother and daughter placing the documents on the table and looking directly at what was there. No embellishment. No avoidance. I told her everything again, slowly. Laura listened without interrupting. There were very long moments of silence, but they were not moments of distance. There were moments when each of us faced our own pain. I realized then that the truth, when looked at directly, did not separate us. It placed us on the same side, not to stand against anyone, but so that no one would have to carry this alone. When Laura left, she hugged me tightly. I understood that the road ahead would not be easy, but at least we were no longer divided by things left unsaid. The truth had spread, slowly but clearly, and in that process, no one was left behind. I did not intend to help anyone when I started working at the bookstore. I only needed a place to steady myself, a rhythm slow enough that I would not be swept away by everything that was happening. But sometimes, when you sit still long enough, others find their way to you. At first, it was just casual questions. One woman asked me about books on money and marriage. Another stood for a long time in front of the self-help section, then turned to me and asked whether I believed a woman's intuition was real. I did not offer advice. I simply listened. And when it felt appropriate, I said that I, too, had once not known what I was standing in front of. We did not call it sharing or support. Just brief conversations between two people who did not need to appear strong. I didn't tell my story dramatically. I did not emphasize loss. I spoke only about the minimal signs I had once ignored, about that vague feeling when everything is said to be fine, but inside, it does not feel entirely so. I did not judge. I did not tell anyone what to do immediately. I knew that each person had a different situation, a different threshold. Some were not ready to look at it directly. Some only needed confirmation that they were not imagining things. Sometimes that alone was enough to stop them from blaming themselves further. Once, a woman told me she was afraid that if she asked too many questions, her family would no longer be peaceful. I understood that fear. I had lived in it for a very long time. I only said that peace maintained by not seeing the truth is a very fragile peace, not to frighten her more, but to let her know that her unease was not something to be ashamed of. I do not see myself as a hero. I did not save anyone. I am simply someone who has walked through a difficult stretch and does not want others to think they have to walk alone. I do not make my pain my identity. It is part of me, but it is not all that I am. Each time someone tells me they feel lighter after speaking aloud what they had kept hidden, I know I am in the right place, not because I have done something extraordinary, but because I have learned not to turn away from the truth. And when you do not turn away, it becomes easier for others to step out of silence as well, in their own way. 1 year after Richard's death, I returned to a bank. Not the old one tied to heavy memories, but a small branch near my home. I did not bring many documents, just my ID, a few necessary forms, and an envelope containing the wages I had saved from the bookstore. I opened a new account in my name only. The bank clerk asked if I wanted to add anyone else. I smiled and shook my head, not because I did not trust anyone, but because I understood that there are parts of life for which one must take full responsibility alone. As I filled in my name on the form, I paused for a moment. I did not erase the past. I did not deny the years that had been lived. My marriage was real. Our love was real too. But I did not let all of that define who I would be from this point on. I chose to place the past where it belonged, as something completed. When I stepped out of the bank, I stood for a while under the awning. There was no sense of victory, no great joy, just a very clear quiet. I knew I was no longer avoiding anything. I was no longer carrying resentment. What needed to be seen had been seen. What needed to be addressed had been and continued to be addressed. If there is one thing I learned from all of this, it is that kindness must go hand in hand with clarity. Trusting others is not wrong, but giving up the right to know about one's own life is not love. The truth does not destroy what is solid. It only brings down what was never truly standing. I do not know what the future will bring, but I know I am walking more lightly. Not because every difficulty has disappeared, but because I am no longer deceiving myself. And when a person lives honestly with themselves, peace does not arrive as a reward. It comes naturally. I return to myself without haste, without fear, simply returning after a very long journey.